Hello everyone, this is Dr. Snelson from Boise State University, Department of Educational Technology. And in this presentation I'm going to talk about web accessibility and provide an overview of the rules and guidelines that are commonly used to determine whether or not a web page and website are accessible. Well, first of all, let's just look at accessibility in general. For example, if you were to see this beautiful scene, if you were to be at this place and see these stairs, they probably wouldn't be accessible to you if you were in a wheelchair. It'd be pretty hard to get down there. It's not very accessible. So can someone in a wheelchair go here? Well, not easily. Not unless they're carried or have a helicopter. And then maybe not. But that's what accessibility is. It deals with how people with disabilities are able to access things. Pretty straightforward. And on a web page, accessibility deals with how people are able to use content that's available. So let's say that we have someone with a visual impairment and they rely on a screen reader to read the information on the page because they can't see it. We're going to have to make sure that that web page is written in such a way that they can do that. And that is web accessibility. So there are some rules and guidelines that govern what this means. Well, we've got Section 508, which is the 1998 Amendment to the Rehabilitation Act, and this applies to federal agencies to make sure that employees of federal agencies or people who use information produced by federal agencies are able to access and use that information. And it may apply to you as well, depending on your situation. But there are 16 rules for web-based information and applications, and these are located on the www.section508.gov website, and you can read all about Section 508 there. In this presentation, I'm going to go through the 16 rules and quickly explain the gist of what they're about. Now, we also have the WCAG. This is the Worldwide Web Consortium Standards for Web Accessibility. Now, the W3C provides all kinds of standards for things on the web. They provide the standards for HTML, XHTML, CSS, and more. So they also have the WCAG, and those are categorized in 4 principles with 14 guidelines, which I will show you at the end of the presentation. And of course, you can go on the web and find these at www.w3.org/tr/WCAG20. Okay, let's start looking at Section 508 and then we'll finish up with WCAG at the end. Section 508, the very first rule, that we will provide a text equivalent for every non-text element. So suppose we put an image in a web page. Well, an image, screen readers can't read these very well. So we provide alternative text in the tag with some kind of descriptive phrase that provides another way access to this information. That's Rule A. And then B, if we have multimedia, things like audio and video, we might want to put closed captioning to provide a text alternative for people who cannot hear that information. Web pages shall be designed so that information conveyed in color is also available without color. So suppose we're using diagrams. Maybe we're teaching the human heart and talking about blood flow and maybe talking about the pink arrows and the blue arrows and talking about how the blood flows by using these colors. Well, if we're on a web page, we should also provide a text description of some kind as an alternative way to access that same information. So that is what they're talking about there. If it's in color, well, some people have color blindness. They won't be able to use that information unless it can come from another way, a text description or something in the context that helps them get that information. And Rule D, documents shall be organized so they are readable without a style sheet. Now remember, in Firefox we can actually turn off the style sheet, and when we do, the web page will be unstyled, but it should still be usable. The information should be written in a logical way that without the style sheet, someone can use that information. And these next two rules deal with image maps. Now an image map, we put an image on a web page and you can add clickable regions to that image. And this can be done on the server, and that's what they mean by a server-side image map, or it can be done in the XHTML code, and it becomes a client-side image map. Now the client-side map is better for accessibility, so we want to try to use those. In fact, we're going to be creating this later in the semester in EdTech 502. And the next two rules deal with tables, which can be very complicated and hard to navigate with a screen reader. So we're moving away from table layouts because they're not very accessible, but we can still use tables for information, for data, and there are ways that we can mark up the rows and columns so that people with screen readers can hear what's going on and have it read correctly and still get the information. And of course we'll do that later in the semester too in this course. So frames shall be titled with text that facilitates frame identification and navigation. If I can encourage the world to never use frames, better to avoid them. But if for those who have them, this rule applies to making frames more accessible. And Part J, Rule J, deals with flickering things and minimizing screen flicker. So here is yet another reason why not to have those annoying flashing GIFs or blinks or marquees in the code that flicker on the screen, because it could actually cause someone to have a seizure if it's at the right frequency. And we don't want to do that, so let's just avoid flickering things on the screen. And this is why I get kind of upset with people who use those little flashy graphics. They're annoying anyway, unless you're a brand new web designer and then everything that flashes seems cool, and that you get over that pretty fast, and then you find out that it's really annoying because people can't pay attention to the screen without seeing that thing blinking. And it's also a problem for people who might have seizure disorders or epilepsy or something that could get set off by that. Not good. So we'll avoid that. If all else fails, you can create a text-only page to provide equivalent information. If you can't make your page or your content accessible, this is another way to go. It's not the best way to go because it's a lot of extra work. If you can make the original content accessible, it's a lot better. And a lot of software tools these days allow you some way to create accessible content. So, but this is the backup plan: a text-only page with equivalent content, equivalent information or functionality. This is another way that you can get around this and make sure that people can access that information. If you're using scripting languages, JavaScript, PHP, things like that, to display content or to create interface elements, the information shall also be identified with functional text that can be read by assistive technology. So if you're using a lot of stuff that looks like that, then of course you want to make sure that whatever you're doing on the page that's dynamic can be read by assistive technology in some way. Your page might require an applet or plugin. We use a lot of Flash Player on web pages these days and QuickTime. So if those are embedded in the page, there needs to be a way for people to get that plugin, a link to the plugin. And usually that's in the code that embeds it, but you can also add one of these badges that links to the page where they can get the download, or just put a link in there and tell them how to get that. And that's good practice anyway. If you're going to use something like QuickTime or Flash in your web page, It's good practice to provide a way for people to get that or update it so that they will have it to use to view your content. Now this is part N, deals with electronic forms. When you fill out a form online, these need to be designed so that people with assistive technology can access the information and use the form and not get lost in it or get hung up because they're using assistive technology. So they should be able to access the information, field elements, and functionality of the form. Rule O deals with repetitive navigation links. And a lot of pages on websites, when you click from page to page, you're going to use repetitive links, right? This is how we navigate from one page to another in a multi-page site. Well, if you're using a screen reader, every time you go to a new page, you get to listen to the screen reader read all of that over and over again. So what this rule is talking about is skip navigation. You can add a link that allows them to bypass that, and it will jump them right over to the main content and not read all of that. Again, it gives them an option. So that's what this deals with. And here's timed response information. If there's something on the page that requires users to respond within a certain amount of time, the user should be alerted and given sufficient time to let you know if they need more time. Now we are on the WCAG, the WCAG Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and this is at a glance. I'm putting it all on one page in chunks so you won't get hit with a full page of text at once. So here we go. The first principle is perceivability, and the guidelines under perceivability are that we have text alternatives for non-text content. You'll see some similarities to the 508 rules that we just went through, providing captions and alternatives for audio and video content, making content adaptable, and making it available to assistive technologies. Is there a way for this content to be accessed using assistive technologies? And these are special technologies meant just for helping people who have disabilities. Using sufficient contrast. And this is more than just a simple text design issue. We want to make sure that the text and the background have enough contrast so that somebody can read this. And there are some people who really do need that high contrast. Operable. Making it keyboard accessible. Can they tab through the content? Is there enough time? Here's that time one again, to read and use content. Getting rid of the blinking things so we don't cause seizures. Having consistent navigation, intuitive navigation, and information where needed. Understandable. Is the text readable and understandable? And this applies to content we design for anyone. But if someone has a cognitive impairment, especially so, making content appear and operate in a predictable way. In other words, you wouldn't see different navigation on each page in a site. There would be some similarity among the pages, and that is the repetition principle that we've studied a little bit so far in the Non-Designer's Webbook. It's also nice for accessibility too, the repetition. Helping users avoid and correct mistakes. Maybe they're filling out a form and they've entered something incorrectly. Giving them a chance to correct that is part of the WCAG guidelines. And then finally, robust. Is this content compatible with current and future technologies? Is it robust enough to handle different kinds of things? Okay, here you go. At a glance, the WCAG guidelines. They're pretty reasonable, I think. And this is a lot of these things are just good basic design features that you can add to web pages without a lot of extra effort, and it really improves the accessibility of a web page. So there you have it, a quick overview of Section 508 and the WCAG guidelines. And of course, you can always go to the websites I mentioned earlier in the presentation and learn a whole lot more about all of these. There's quite a lot of information on the web about the 508 and WCAG. You can find plenty to read. Okay, well that is all I have to say about this. Thank you again for watching.